Hi, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about research. I know, it can be a really intimidating topic for a lot of folks, but it doesn't have to be. In fact, research is a really important tool for people to have. Okay, so what does research say about sleep training in the first year? Huge disclaimer, huge disclaimer. I'm going to be talking a lot about the problems with the research on extinction or crying it out. This is not meant to say that crying it out is bad at all. Using crying and different versions of it are super effective for lots and lots and lots of people, and it happens without drama and it works and everybody's happier, and that's great. What I really have a problem with is, number one, the universality of this as the only approach, and also where it's gone in terms of how it's been taken from research and now adapted into popular parenting discourse and parenting advice. There are things that are said in the parenting books that are not at all based in the research. So it's really important for us to parse it out, to ask a better question, to say, who does it work for? Who does it not work for? And things like how much crying is too much crying, right? Nobody's asking those questions of the research. And I think that that's a huge problem. And I think a lot of parents are suffering because of it. So again, this is not an anti-crying talk at all. I just want us to really look critically at what the research actually says and then where it's gone off the rails when it comes to what we're actually telling parents. Okay, so we do know that sleep problems have serious consequences. No question. There are short-term problems, and now they're saying longer-term problems of broken sleep in infancy. I have a bit of a problem with some of the longer-term ideas because often the research silently assumes that this stuff will happen if nothing is done, right? If you just let sleep problems go. I also think that there are temperamental and regulatory factors that underlie both the sleep problems and the later issues. They draw a straight line from sleep problems to obesity, sleep problems to ADHD. I think there's other stuff that informs both of those. Okay. So we know the sleep problems are bad. What does research say to do? Okay, this comes purely from behaviorism. Back in the 20s, John Watson and others really saw infants as a blank slate who came into the world with nothing and only responded to what they learned from the outside world. As a result, all of the foundational sleep research, all of it, is from that paradigm that whatever you pay attention to persists and whatever you ignore will go away. 99.9% of the research that's out there looks at parental behavior as the driver of sleep problems. And as a result, they say then that the solution is to fix parental behavior. Karen France is the leading researcher on extinction and says parental attention to distress reinforces and maintains crying and substitutes parent-related cues for the bed-related ones. If parental reinforcement is withheld, the distress behavior undergoes extinction. That's the concept behind all of the original sleep training information. And two, the infant as malleable, right? The infant is eminently trainable by withholding reinforcement or soothing in those times of distress. A purely behavioral perspective does not consider any individual or systemic influences to be relevant at all. Extinction research does not even consider temperament or physical health or development or feeding status or parental values. They just say it's all about behavior and we're just going to focus on behavior. All those moving parts are harder to research. Systemic research is extremely difficult to do. And really, a lot of times it's way easier for them to just go purely towards behavior. So here are the current interventions in research and the terms used for that. The first kind is called pure extinction. We call it cold turkey. That's where you put the baby in the bed, you close the door, you don't go until morning. They discovered early on that parents really hated that. And so researchers came up with what they called a gentler approach, which was graduated extinction. That's verberizing, controlled crying, all those different terms where parents can go in at varying intervals Graduated means lengthening. There's time checks, which is exactly the same interval. That's all the same thing, pretty much the same idea. There's another kind, this one's super confusing in the research. For as precise as research is supposed to be, I don't quite get how this one can be so incredibly muddy. But it's called extinction with parental presence, or camping out. Camping out is pure extinction with the parent in the room. So basically the parent sleeps on a mattress, the baby cries and cries and cries, the parent does not respond, but the parent is there. That's the real definition of it. They can also throw in there parental fading, which is the parent does what they were doing before to soothe the baby, and then they just back that off over time. To me, those sound like two completely separate ideas and approaches, but in research, they often throw those two in the same bin. I'd love to ask somebody because I don't quite get it. Then here are some other interventions. Bedtime fading, we may all know, which is if a kid has taken a million years to go to sleep, you move their bedtime to the time where they naturally fall or have been naturally falling asleep, get them to fall asleep easy, and then you back bedtime earlier and earlier. Then the fading approach can be called parental fading, or something called stimulus fading, which is what I mentioned already. You're doing what you do, and then you just do less of it over time. And then a lot of the prevention research is called a behavioral package, and goodness knows what that even is. That can be a hodgepodge of things. Often it will be getting the sleep timing right, ruling out other factors, having a good routine. But often in the research, it's super vague about what they actually say. They'll say mothers were given information on sleep and feeding routines, on the importance of good naps, and on appropriate responses to night waking. And they never say what that is. It's really difficult to know what information they're actually giving parents. Okay, so why is research so hot on extinction? What do they say about it? Some research said it only takes a week, that it's easy for parents to understand. They are basically saying if you give parents too many steps, too much detail, they won't be able to follow it, that you have to give them something super clear and super sort of monolithic, because then they can understand it and be consistent. Effective, they just say it over and over and over and over and over, that it's effective. I mean, enough already, right? We know it works. And then this is said constantly too, that no study has ever found any negative side effects to the use of extinction. And you'll see these four ideas repeated a lot. I mean, this is considered so well established that people don't even have to keep proving it. A lot of this research is older. The foundational research was all done in the 80s and 90s and just basically this is what happens in research, right? Something gets documented, and it gets documented and recited so intensely that it becomes unassailable. It's just is a fact. And the stuff about extinction is definitely that way. Reported benefits, they say it improves parental sleep, it decreases stress, better daytime behavior in the child. Karen France says it increases child likability and agreeableness, improvements in the mother's perceived control of the child. In fact, now they've done lit reviews and systematic reviews, and now it's kind of codified into practice recommendations. And they'll generally say pure extinction is the most well established, but that parents can't do it. So it's like, well, if parents can't do it, then graduated extinction. And so it's really ensconced in kind of a vault of research knowledge. Because of the number of studies, it's considered the only approach, not because it's better, but simply because it's the most researched. That's another problem with research, is it's not the best, it's just that it's the most researched, which we can say, why aren't other things looked at? We're going to start deconstructing some stuff. Let's look at it's quick. Pure extinction is considered quick. It's considered to only take 3 days, but that's 3 days of pure crying, right? Some professionals have suggested the problem will abate in 3 to 4 days. However, their study indicated that it took 3 weeks or more before the awakening and crying were reduced to less than 4 per week. 3 to 4 weeks is way different than what books are saying. And the studies that I looked at, children were still waking weeks into the study. So again, we have to remember that in studies, they're just looking for improvement in sleep behavior, not total resolution. It's necessary. Researchers suggest that sleep problems in early infancy persists long term, assuming nothing is done. They also say it's well established that across studies, about 20 to 25% of infants have a sleep problem. And that means about 75% don't. But we're recommending sleep interventions for 100% of infants. We're telling parents, if you don't sleep train, your child will have a sleep problem. There's really no research on that point at all, at all. Easy to understand. I already explained this, that this is a quote from Eckerberg study. The advice given was very specific and authoritative, presenting no alternative methods. Most parents had tried many different methods to make the child sleep through the night before seeking help, resulting in low self-esteem. This concept implies that parents may be incapable of choosing between different treatment alternatives. So yeah, I don't know what to think about that. Okay, so effectiveness is another really important area that we want to look at super carefully. What does effective mean? Some studies found no difference between intervention and control groups at follow-up. So here's the deal. They do an intervention for a certain period of time, then they take an assessment and they say, yeah, this was different. And then they'll go maybe a couple of months down the road and they'll test again. So in several of these pretty pivotal studies, there was a difference at the end of the intervention and then no difference by 2 months later, meaning that it didn't last or parents couldn't stick it out outside of the holding that takes place in a research study. In a recent randomized control trial, remember one of those great big ones, found only a 1% difference between the intervention and the control group in terms of how many infants were still waking twice per night. Again, statistically, there might have been a difference. If you look at the actual numbers, only 1% more, which is interesting. I think it's really interesting. If you told parents you'll have a 1% chance that your kid's sleep will be better if you do crying it out, parents are going to be like, no, I don't want to. So this one, Adams and Reichert, at the follow-ups, the graduate extinction group still had 15 to 20 minutes of crying. In this one's, children were still waking twice a night. At the 3-month follow-up, children were still waking an average of once per night for almost 20 minutes. And they only slept 27 minutes longer because they were awake less time at each wake up. So it's important when you go look at some of these studies to look at the actual differences in sleep behavior. And then you decide if you feel like that's a solid piece of evidence for improvement. It's not working in the way that parents would think it's working, for sure. Parents' expectations or what parents are told to expect can be way different than what the research actually finds. So hold on to your critical thinking hats, because across almost all the studies, extinction did not work for between 25 and 50% of the sample. Remember that research deals in averages. They deal in the mean of the group. That doesn't mean everybody had the same level of success. It means there's a fairly large chunk of every sample for whom sleep did not improve at all. This is important because it's not about saying, well, let's ditch the intervention, not at all. But advice doesn't have any space in it currently that this might not work for you. And that's a big group of people within those contexts of research where they're getting a lot of support. Extinction didn't work for everybody. So I don't know why we're giving parents the message that if you just do it right, it will work for you. We have to also look at what actually improved in these studies. Sometimes it was not the sleep. A lot of times it was the parents' perception of the sleep problem, which I don't know, you could say that's just as important. If a parent really feels better about it, hey, that's awesome. A meta-analysis concluded that psychosocial sleep interventions appear to impact the amount of sleep that a mother reports her baby to have, although the infants continued to wake just as frequently. In some studies, there was a big difference between what parents reported as wakings and the little actigraph. The actigraph is like a little machine that a baby wears on their ankle. The baby's sleep behavior didn't change at all. The parents' perception of the sleep behavior changed. Sometimes interventions affected total nighttime sleep, but not awakenings. So the baby still woke up 3 times, they just woke up for less time at each awakening. I don't know about you, but as a parent, I would still be quite frustrated about the 3 awakenings, even if they were short. So effect on the duration of nighttime sleep is generally small. And then what really improves? Even Eckerberg says it's likely that mood improvements made parents more accepting of their children's behavior and rated it more favorably after the interventions. So we have to think about what are sleep interventions actually improving sleep in research or something else. What part of the intervention was the active ingredient? There's a big difference between how the information gets deployed in a research study and parents actually taking it home. So that's called transportability. How well does it translate from a research setting into the real world? In the research setting, these parents are getting a lot of holding. This is probably spoiler alert, but in a bunch of these, it was done in an inpatient setting. So in Australia, there are sleep clinics where moms and a baby can go. The mom gets a lot of support, mental health interventions, meals brought to her. In one of these studies, the nurse took the baby and did the sleep training. I don't see how you can compare that to a parent at home with a book, right? Those are two completely separate conditions. So it's really important to understand that research really is a whole different world. And yet they point to the intervention as being the successful part of it. So another disclaimer, because we're going to be looking at crying and how they measured negative impact. This is another disclaimer. This is not about that all crying is traumatic. Absolutely not. It's super important to know, what does the research say and how did they measure it? Only 11 studies have ever looked at any effects on the child. Here is how the effects are typically assessed. These are the measures. And this is, remember how I said sometimes it's important to know what the measures are? The main study showing no negative effects was done by Karen France in 1996. And she was measuring whether there were emotional outcomes from using extinction. She used this thing called the Flint Infant Security Scale, which was created in 1974 to measure security. Now, in the 70s, that's when attachment as a theory was really, they were just starting to think about how to assess attachment. And back then they called it security. This woman created this scale trying to get at security. But the questions, when you look at the infant security scale, are things that to me speak more to aspects of temperament or something else that's not security at all. So some of the questions are things like accepts new foods readily, will allow a stranger to change the diaper, likes rough play. I don't see how that measures emotional effects or emotional security. That all sounds to me like development, because it depends on if the child has stranger anxiety, and some temperament attributes. But that Flint Infant Security Scale has been used over and over and over again to measure whether a child had some kind of repercussions from extinction. And then parent report a lot. We talk about social desirability bias, which means if you ask a parent after they've just done extinction, hey, do you think you harmed your baby? What are they going to say? Are they going to be able to say yes? Plus, a parent who might have gotten some more sleep is automatically going to view everything more positively. So again, we can't just rely on parent report. And then there's the child behavior checklist, which generally is for older kids, and they're looking for, did the kids who went through extinction have behavioral problems? The CBCL is a really great measure. I don't really have a problem with it. I just don't, sometimes I feel like the way they look for negative effects is like looking for something you don't want to find, right? It's like, no, I have no idea. Where is it? Nope, it's not over here, right? It's not always super nuanced. I do want you to note the age range of these kiddos, 6 to 24 months. Karen France definitely says extinction should never be used with babies under 6 months. And even then, only with a lot of support and guidance and monitoring, which is interesting. Here's the other problem with most of these studies. They almost never say how much crying actually happened. So if you say we put these kids through extinction and we didn't find any negative effects, that's fine. But Did all these babies cry 15 minutes? Okay, then we know that 15 minutes of crying didn't have an effect. Were they crying for an hour? Okay, then an hour didn't have an effect, but we have no idea. Most of these studies never tell us how long infants were crying, most of them. And then her results showed improved likability, which I don't know, gives me the willies a little bit. They showed improvements in likability and agreeableness, but when you look at the raw scores, there was only a 1 point difference. So again, it was not a big change between the two groups. The investigation of negative effects lacks specificity. Most of the time, they don't say how much infants were crying and at what ages. So what we can gather from the research that's out there is crying was not harmful in the way they measured it, in the subjects they included in their sample, and who cried for an unspecified amount of time. For me, given development and the differences in development, as well as the effects by temperament and age, it's really important to know at this age with this amount of crying, there were no impacts. Ooh, babies of this age with that amount of crying, that wasn't good. We have no idea about that. We got to a point where it's so ensconced that extinction doesn't cause harm that nobody's asking other questions anymore. We do know that at certain developmental stages, limited crying is totally benign, not a problem, but it can't be said for all babies at all stages in all contexts. Stress at certain periods of brain development can cause disruption for some babies. And for sensitive infants, stress that could be handled, this is Alan Shore, stress that could be handled by a mellower infant could be disorganized. We really need to do some more fine-grained research on how much crying is too much, how much is fine. Research also overlooks the effect of temperament. And as you probably know, my area of work says that temperament is everything when it comes to sleep. And kiddos who are more intense and less adaptable are going to be the ones crying for longer periods of time. Research doesn't technically take temperament into account. So we actually don't know if that 25 to 50% of people for whom extinction didn't work were all intense, alert babies. It's possible. We'll just never know. So what does parenting advice say? So now we know that there's like a little bit of a mixed bag with research. So now let's compare that to what parents are being told in sleep books and programs. And I'm going to include some of the online programs, Taking Care of Babies, Moms on Call. Sleep issues have scary consequences. Boy, we scare parents to death. Sleep training is absolutely necessary to prevent these horrible consequences. Using some form of extinction is the best, most evidence-based approach, and it's been shown to be fast, effective, and without side effect. You have to start early to prevent bad habits, or else it will be harder, if not impossible, to do later. So here's a quick and dirty comparison of some of the best-selling sleep books. This is only a few of them. There are lots out there. So this is Weissbluth. Weissbluth says to start extinction with a 45 pure extinction at a 45-minute cap as early as 6 weeks. 3 to 4 months, you can use cold turkey, and he says it's going to work in 4 nights. Precious Little Sleep says to start at 2 or 3 months with fuss it out 10-minute time checks. Also at 3 to 4 months, pure extinction. Baby Sleep Solution. This is the book that used to be called 12 Hours Sleep by 12 Weeks. This is mostly about stretching feeds. Their program isn't necessarily about crying necessarily, but it looks like 8 to 12 weeks, a very brief wait before responding. And she says the baby should stay in the crib for a full 12 hours by this age. Taking Care of Babies says to start at 3 months, start with the lowest intervention and move up to a feed, and then by 5 months do graduated extinction. Promises that it'll work in 7 to 14 days. Moms on Call, they have a book, but it's mostly, I think, an online program. They say that at 2 weeks, start at graduated extinction, and by 3 months, cold turkey. Baby should stay in the crib, no swaddle for a full 12 hours. And then this is another one super worrying to me. This is a major pediatric practice, and it's right on their website. You can see it for yourself. At 8 weeks, put the baby in the bed, close the door, don't go until morning. Okay, so what does the research say about using extinction before 6 months? I should have had cricket sound cues there. Yeah, it says almost nothing. So this is from my research. I've updated it with more recent studies. This is research using pure extinction, and these are the sample age ranges. So here's 12 months, here's 6 months. I want to highlight these two that do show pure extinction under 6 months, but these little diamonds are the mean or the average of the group. This one doesn't have it because this one says children under 60 months. It does not even say how many infants are in the sample, and same with this one. They don't even say whether there are babies under 6 months in the sample. So even though it says under 60 months, we don't know if there's any babies in there. Every other one is 6 months and up, and a lot of them are really older, more like 9 months. You can see this, that's more like 9 months and up. That's pure extinction. Okay, here's graduated extinction. Now there's more in the under a year range, but if you look still at under 6 months, there are very few, and ones like this one is like 3 weeks to 3 years, or one of these is 4 to 52 months. This one looks like it's 4 months to 42 months. That's a huge age range. And none of these studies parcel out the effects by age. It'll just say sleep improved across the whole sample, but we really don't know anything about what the babies in those samples did. And these ones under 6 months are, well, Eckerberg is inpatient. These two are definitely the inpatient studies. There's this one that used 5-month-olds, this one that used birth to a year, I think. But if you just go down here, there's almost nothing under 6 months. That means we know very, very little about using extinction with babies younger than 6 months, despite the fact that almost all the advice says to start at 3 or 4 months. Sometimes there's vague definitions like wait a short time, but they don't say what that means. The other thing is that research looking at younger babies, it's usually with a goal of prevention. If they use any delay that they talk about, it's very, very brief. They're not talking about 20, 45 minutes, an hour, or pure extinction. So it's very different in research from what the books say. No studies have compared the efficacy or the effects of behavioral interventions instituted at different ages. So this idea that if you do it at 3 months, you'll prevent sleep problems later, or if you do it at 3 months, it'll be easier than if you wait to start at 6 months. There's literally no research on that at all. It is totally, totally made up. In prevention studies, no studies have looked at whether effects last past a few months. Some of the prevention studies, the effects faded. So if they instituted it at 3 months, by 4 months, there was really no effect. A meta-analysis says there's insufficient evidence about what type of intervention is the most effective at which ages. There's a huge disconnect between the research and advice. In terms of the meta-analysis, there's no evidence showing that preventive interventions reduced mother-reported night waking. It just didn't work. We have to say, why are we telling parents to do something that we're not entirely sure works? The other important thing is parents don't like using crying it out. For some parents, they're ready for it. It works without a lot of stress. It's 1 or 2 or maybe 3 nights of really tolerable, mild fussing, and it's over and it stays that way. And boy, honestly, have a party. That's awesome. But it's not that way for a lot of parents, and certainly most of the ones that I end up talking to. Why do we have to talk parents into doing something? Why can't we give them alternatives? And there are alternatives. So we know that extinction might not work for everybody. We don't know that any amount of crying is perfectly benign. Behavioral approaches have to be used with an awareness of the contextual aspects of sleep. Parents with a temperamentally more sensitive, intense child need a different approach than crying it out because it doesn't always work. We do know that alternative methods work. Maternal or parental emotional availability at bedtime has been shown to improve sleep and reduce cortisol, reduces stress for everybody. Also, response-based gradual approaches result in better sleep. There's a study that shows it's a more gradual, responsive approach where parents get to be with the child, reduces stress for everybody, and parents just feel better about having to do it. All of these also have been shown in the research to work. They just don't get as much press. parental fading, scheduled awakenings, white noise, a sleep diary, a bedtime routine. And it's important to note that no intervention has been shown to work better than any other. So really, it's about giving parents something that they feel good about and having them just do that. I think that the advice that's out there has made parents way more anxious about sleep and way more doubtful of their own abilities to solve the problem. And what happens then is parents are just jumping ship too soon because they don't trust that they're doing the right thing or that they know what to do. And I place some of that blame on the advice that's out there and the tone of it that focuses so exclusively on behavior. Because when we focus on behavior, that means that when it doesn't work, it's the parent's fault. And that's also not super true. I sure hope this has been helpful and illuminating, and I hope you all have lots and lots of questions because I will be ready to answer them. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will talk to you all soon.